It's one of the greatest stories ever told. David can finally catch his breath. He's on top, he's king, the one everyone talks about. It started with Goliath and a missile from a sling. It continued as he assembled his army. Mighty men echoed in the lore of Robin Hood's Merry Men. It went on as he fought alongside King Saul, but made the mistake, was it really a mistake, of being a better commander. Revealed in the cheers of the women dancing in celebration, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. It had been a bloody, violent sprint since that day on the field where he, an unknown shepherd boy, had faced a giant, but he had emerged in glory. Not that it was without a cost. Saul had been a father figure and turned on him, tried to kill him. He knew that David threatened his dynasty and that his own son, Jonathan, loved David so much he would allow it. David lost Saul in life and then on the battlefield. And Jonathan, who was at the least his best friend, was taken away by politics and then by death on the same field as the king. But David had emerged in glory. His power unquestioned, enemies at his feet, stable of wives growing, his beauty lauded. He had gained so much, it seemed to him that he should do something nice for God. God and he, after all, were tight. If you read the David story, and you want to read it from 1st rather than 2nd Samuel, you realize this is practically the birth of the modern novel. But you also see how tight David and God were. When David asks a question, God just answers. Lord, should I go up against this army? God responds, sure. It's an easy, intimate relationship. And it seems like God never says no. Nathan the prophet certainly thinks this way. David says, hey, I'm in a house of cedar and God's living in a tent. And Nathan basically says, well, go build. God's with you. But here God finally says no. No, David, you won't do that. I will build you a house. It's a no, but an answer promising forever. And how did this make David feel? Probably so good that he started to believe his press clippings, that he could do no wrong, that he was above all others, that his bodily processes only yielded ice cream. And he fell into that all too human trap, confusing what he wanted with what God required. And the problems start. He saw her bathing on a roof, right? Bathsheba, he sees her up there on the roof. She is the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his loyal soldiers off fighting one of his battles. He takes her, he gets her pregnant, and then, no doubt to save his reputation, has the man killed. God comes in punishment. Sin engulfs his house. Eventually, his too many children reflect the worst in him, a messy, spoiled lot, failing to understand the cost of the wealth they possess. His own son will try to overthrow him and be killed. And at his death, Solomon would reign, yes, and do damage. And afterwards, the kingdom would split into two and stay that way. But also that connection to God. David still has it, but it's never quite as easy and intimate again. The last lines of Joseph Heller's book, God Knows, a rip-roaring, crazy read of the David story, imagines the frustration of David with this at the end of his life. He's on his deathbed, being attended to by Abishag, and he says, I ask for my God, and they send me a girl. God wanted to build David a house. But David made the mistake of trying to build it his way and not God's. He believed his press clippings. He mistook even lust as something he would be allowed to partake in. He forgot that his way would not always be God's way. He forgot God might even judge him. And history, as they say, repeats itself. This week, the New York Times, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles has agreed to pay $880 million to victims of clergy sexual abuse dating back decades. A payment from this archdiocese alone that brings its payments to victims of abuse to $1.5 billion. Many evangelical congregations are rife with the same kinds of problems. The leader of the Gateway Church, one of the largest in the country, just resigned for his actions against a 12-year-old and a 19-year-old, abuse that lasted for years, actions carried out while telling his victims that this was God's will. In 2022, an external report exposed the extent of sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Conference, finding essentially that in the 2 decades preceding, some 380 clergy, lay leaders, and volunteers faced allegations of sexual misconduct from more than 700 victims. Fortunately, we Lutherans have far, far less to talk about here, but we've had our enraging scandals too. Why? Why does this happen? I think a lot of it is illness, but a lot of it is confusing what we want with what God requires. I blame celibacy for a lot of this, and celibacy only became the undisputed norm for priests in the late 1400s, early 1500s, and I suppose the intention was somewhat good, to be all there for God, even though Judaism and the early church never required it. I think every church leader, hopefully, goes into ministry with good intentions, only wanting to bring grace and love to people. But too many people tell you how wonderful you are, and things could start to happen. Couple that with illness, loneliness, despair. You can lose your way. And yes, then try to hide it. David surely told himself that hiding his scandal was good for the kingdom. But part of him knew better, too. And of course, this doesn't just affect churches, kingdoms, countries, companies. Mistaking what we want for what God wants, that is human sin 101. And we make the mistake of misinterpreting God's desire to do good for us with the fact that this also means we are to act with and for God. The Jewish people eventually built a huge temple with elaborate worship. What did the prophets say? Just be good to the poor, to the alien in your midst. Love God completely. Churches amass buildings, wealth, influence. What does God say? Do justice. Love, mercy, walk humbly. And when we look at our lives and our own gifts, our actions, our desires, well, what should we be doing? When things are good, we should be happy, of course. But don't believe the press clippings. We need to measure what we are doing against what God would have us do. And when things are not so good, we need to remember we're forgiven. David prayed for a clean heart after his sin, and he was restored. Yes, his actions made life messy, and sin did hurt his house and his life, but he remained God's. And despite our failings, we are God's. The coming of Christ, which we will begin to anticipate in a few weeks, is for us the culmination of this promise God gives David today. Jesus is here now, and with you always in love and forgiveness and hope. And he reminds us, no matter the sin, we are his, and that every day is another chance to walk with him. Every day is a new day for God to create in us a clean heart.